Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for listening. I'm really excited today. I'm here with Anderson Todd. I've been looking forward to this for ages. He's a cognitive scientist and registered psychotherapist and many other things. And so maybe why don't you introduce yourself a bit, talk about the things you're interested in, and then let's get into this.
Sure. So thanks for having me, Jack. Much appreciated. Yeah, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. And I've taught in cognitive science, in Buddhist psychology and mental health, and in the interdisciplinary courses on Jungian theory, which is a mouthful. But it is an apropos mouthful because, in fact, today is the anniversary of Carl Jung's birthday. So, in fact, you've picked
Okay,
an
awesome.
auspicious time for this. But yeah, so yeah, I'm a professor. I teach. I'm also involved in research. So I'm one of the co-founders, along with Dr. John Vervaeke, of the Consciousness and Wisdom Studies Laboratory at U of T. And in addition to that, I'm what? I'm a registered psychotherapist, so I maintain a private practice. So I see clients domestically and internationally for psychotherapeutic issues. And then, a sprinkle of other hats, half a dozen other hats, depending on what projects I'm involved with at the time. I've done a fair bit of startup work. I was a writer for a long time professionally. I do a bit of professional dungeon mastering, or
Good.
have done. So yeah, it's a pretty broad basket.
Awesome. Thank you. And it's good that you mentioned, I didn't know it was Young's anniversary of his birthday. I wanted to actually start kind of there and as well to just keep this open for any audience. Who was Young and why have you bothered studying him for so long? Why should we be interested in Young? Why is he important?
Mm-hmm. So Carl Jung was the sort of initial foremost disciple of Sigmund Freud. So when we think about the modern sort of psychoanalytical movements, right, we typically think of Freud. And Freud was the dominant figure in that field for a very long time, but had a sort of big cultural shift. So Freud used to be, in some sense, the only game in town. And in more recent decades, unfortunately, has fallen a great deal and is more often than not for in psychological circles is like the butt of a lot of jokes. So that's where people kind of come in, and that's unfortunate. Certainly, it is the case that some of it, like most thinkers, that's deserved. 50% of every theory is wrong, at least. But a lot of it is undeserved. He actually, really had a huge impact, Freud. So Jung was sort of his first sort of major disciple, major follower. And they had a big break around 1913, in which they had a pretty strong disagreement about the fundaments of psychodynamic theory. And uh, Freud basically got the entire mainstream psychodynamic community in the divorce. So it was a very acrimonious breakup. They had an initial high-powered bromance. Jung was sort of known as the heir apparent. He was the crown prince of the discipline. And when they had a falling out, it was explosive, and Jung was really pushed to the margins. When we think about Freud, for instance, there's some key things that come up, and the jokes typically reflect this, right? This is the classic lying on the couch 5 days a week and discussing your dreams, in which the
Mm.
therapist reveals to you how in fact you'd like to sleep with your mother. This is sort of the idea. Jung's big break from Freud, in essence, there was a lot of doctrinal differences, but the big difference was that rather than boiling everything down to sex, right, having everything be contingent on libido and the sex drive, a position that Freud himself, in fact, broke from in later years. Jung has this idea that there are other kinds of psychic centers, other forms of development, other factors which are operating in the psyche, which are, relevant to human flourishing. That it's a bit more complicated than what Freud was talking about, and that was, sufficient to sort of really upset the apple cart. A lot of this came out of Jung's own experiences, which is to say, particularly in the wake of their breakup, Jung had what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, which, if you happen to be very sort of psychiatrically orthodox, you would say he had a psychotic break. But the point is that he had these incredibly powerful visionary experiences that went on for years, in which he, really felt like he was losing his mind. And as a way of navigating those waters and not going completely to pieces, what he began to do was engage in dialogue with the sorts of figures that were appearing to him. So he began to allow these visions to sort of play and allow these psychic events to take shape and sort of unfold in his mind. But at the same time, he would interact with them, very often interacting with them as though they were the people that they sort of pretended to be, if that makes sense, right? Mm-hmm. So his inner figures would appear to him in dream and in vision and so on and so forth. And essentially speaking, he decided to take it seriously, not in the standard psychotic fashion of taking it to be reality in the straight sense, but rather interacting with it as though it had something useful to say and as though it was pointing out something pivotal about the functioning of his mind. This was a pretty groundbreaking idea for psychology at the time. Although, in fact, when you look into history, it's something that has roots that go very, very far back. We can consider sort of the Greeks and the idea of the daimon and lots of other inner figure work that we see across religions. But that sort of modern reformulation, in a certain sense, we owe to a great extent to Jung. Jung has been kind of a persistent, slow-burning underground figure ever since, never quite breaking into the mainstream, but also never entirely going away. So, there's been a sort of countercultural current. And it's funny, the places that you see, Jung turn up. He's on the cover of the Beatles album Sgt. Pepper's. His theories had a Police album named after them. And then there's been, of course, an enormous surge of prominence in more recent years, sort of to everybody's surprise, on the twin forks of Jordan Peterson and BTS, who, of course, released a series of Jungian-themed albums. I don't think anybody saw that coming. So there's been a real surge of attention. For my own part, I sort of came across references to Jung early. I was a pretty unusual autodidactic kid. I did a lot of reading. And when I first encountered it, I really couldn't make heads or tails of it to a great extent. But it intrigued me. It seemed as though it was saying things, and the references that I was catching, it was something that was quite sophisticated. And so I can remember sort of cracking open, at the library, trying to crack open some of these core texts when I was, 11 or 12, and not, getting some of it, getting enough for it to be sort of tantalizing while missing in some ways sort of the deeper aspects. And if you've read Jung, this is often still the experience that I have, which is to say that Jung is often a kind of a difficult, a dense read. He can be very arcane in a lot of ways, as opposed to Freud, for instance, who's quite, Freud's very clear. Freud's very clear. Freud is very clear and very persuasive, even when you agree with him and then later go, hey, wait a minute, no. Jung, on the other hand, takes a lot of effort, chewing.
Yeah.
So the superficial ideas are sort of easy to get, but the deeper stuff is quite hard to get. And so I've read the complete works at this point many times, and it's still without fail. Every time I do a read through, I'm still discovering things, and I anticipate I will be for the rest of my life. But the thing that I think Jung, I've said this in a few places, but the thing that I think more than any of the other early psychodynamic theorists, Jung takes seriously the realities of the soul. And what I mean by that, I don't mean that in sort of theological or religious terms specifically, right? I'm not talking about an invisible ghost that lives in your body or something of that kind, or at least not necessarily. Rather, what I'm talking about is that Jung takes very seriously the sort of direct phenomenology of human experience, including where those experiences tend to stray pretty far from the consensus views, where we're talking about mystical experiences and intrusive experiences and the sorts of things that we often don't bring up in polite company. Jung was not afraid to look at those things, talk about them, theorize them, around them. And, like any theorist, I don't happen to agree with everything he says, but I also think that he has some incredibly powerful and functionally useful insights. And so, to a certain extent, probably more than almost any other thinker, Jung has gone an enormous way to inform a lot of my own theory, even where that theory, of course, is being extended by, cognitive science and more modern sort of philosophy in the area.
Yeah. So there's a great stuff, lots of great stuff there. But one thing I wanted to pick up on was you talk about how even though Jung kind of seems like a revolutionary, it's also has its origins in the Greeks, and they pick up on similar ideas. I kind of wanted to ask, it's kind of a weird question, but what would we have done without Jung? Like, I imagine if he didn't exist, like would people have come up with the same sort of insights? With other people have taken up the same kind of mantle? That's something I kind of think about a lot. I don't know if you want to riff on that.
Yeah, I mean, philosophically speaking, you can sort of shorthand and say, if you take Plato and the Neoplatonists, right, the idea of the Platonic forms, and you sprinkle in a bunch of Nietzsche and a bunch of Kant, you stir it all up, you would get Jungian thinking. So in a philosophical sense, Jung is not an enormous innovator, right? He's very, in some sense, kind of derivative of the continental philosophy movements and stuff going back to the early roots of classical philosophy. However, the difference, I think, with Jung specifically is that Jung isn't primarily a philosopher. Jung is primarily a therapist. So he's not, strictly speaking, concerned with synthesizing this material together to form some kind of abstract framework, right, that interests him, and he does a great deal of sort of philosophical work, in a sense, to bring these things together. He's interested in our lived experiences and in how the use of those theories can contribute to our sense of flourishing, right, to our healing. In that sense, I think Jung was perhaps not a completely unique figure, but he occurred at a certain point in time where he really served in sort of the vanguard of people. My friend John Vervaeke sometimes refers to him as one of the sort of prophets of the meaning crisis, is the term that he uses, which I like. Jung, because of his particular point in time, his particular interests, and this idea of applying it in the psychological sense rather than talking about it as a metaphysical theory alone, is really significant. So could Jung have been somebody else? Maybe, but I don't know who. He was a pretty strange, peculiar kind of fellow with, very unique circumstances. So I think those ideas possibly would have emerged in one form or another, but the specifics of what he brought to it really did go a long way towards bringing some of this stuff together in a way that really we hadn't seen before.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up that he wasn't a philosopher, right? And in fact, a lot of the time he talks about, hey, I'm just a psychologist here. I'm just looking at things empirically. And there's a book that might interest you, and it might lead us to a nice discussion, which is called Decoding Jung's Metaphysics by Bernardo Kastrup. Have you read this book?
I have.
Okay. You're young, you studied Jung. I would imagine you went, okay, awesome.
And I like Kastrup, so.
Yeah, so what do you think of, so in that sense, he's kind of an idealist. So you could imagine that he thinks about not just our own psyche as being important, but that the collective unconscious and then even matter itself, basically the whole universe, is actually psyche. I mean, what do you think of that? Do you think that it's plausible Jung thought that? And what are kind of the implications?
Well, there's always a problem when you're talking about Jung's thinking, which is that he, released his work, his books over a period of 50 years, and his thinking is evolving to a significant extent throughout that. He reformulates ideas. So I teach Jung at the university. I think we maybe have the only sort of dedicated Jung program in the world. Maybe not, but Pacifica actually might be another place, but certainly anyway, it's rare. And when we do a full year course on this, one of the things that I say to my students off the bat is, look, we're going to be covering this in a somewhat introductory schematic fashion, but you can sort of adjust the timeline slider on Jung exactly until you think it's too crazy for you, and then stop there. Because Jung starts with ideas that are intended to be very scientifically palatable. He, makes the analogy that, for instance, his idea of the archetype and the complex are a bit like, psychic reflexes, right? So they're sort of these automatic structures that are just built into the psyche, and they're effectively biological, and so on and so forth. He uses a lot of metaphors of this form. But the further on he goes, the deeper he is going into trying to explore the kinds of metaphysical claims that you're talking about. And Kastrup picks up on this. Now, I don't know that it's necessarily true to say that he is an idealist in the strict sense. He certainly toyed with that. But I think that he didn't really stabilize that position. It's one of the things, to be honest, that I appreciate about Jung and have to some extent adopted in my own work, which is that Jung privileges completeness, I think, over consistency. He's more concerned with making sure that he's looking at everything than to be overly concerned with making sure that everything consistently lines up, right? He's trying to line it up, but when push comes to shove, he's more interested in making sure that he isn't leaving things out. And that is a somewhat unusual position, I think, in theoretical work, and it's a position I share, the privileging completeness over consistency. So, yeah, I mean, one of the problems that Jung is struggling with, as indeed philosophy has for a very long time, is the mind-body problem. He's taking a stab at the mind-body problem, and some of his contributions to that problem, which is, as we say in philosophy, a hard problem, or the hard problem, to borrow from Dave Chalmers. It's this question of how mind and the world connect. I mean, it's a big question. Now, for most therapists, I think, and for most psychologists, this is sort of it's really a side question. It's like, if you can't solve it, whatever, just study the mind. Jung was not content to do this. He came to the belief that what we call mind is not nearly as constrained or contained as we tend to think about it in sort of post-Cartesian Western ideas. And so he has things like synchronicity, right, which the Police album is named after. This is the idea that meaningful coincidences can be manifested, right, where simultaneously you're having an event in the psyche, but also an event in the world with no apparent causal connection. And so, one of the things that he did that was a bit unusual is he worked with probably the greatest quantum scientist of the period, Wolfgang Pauli. And the two of them worked together to develop this theory, synchronicity, and a causal connecting principle. And they were putting their finger on something that really was radically new. Both of them knew it, right? In early quantum theory, Pauli was looking at certain kinds of effects that were, completely breaking out of our scientific understanding up to the period, right? Up to that, we had a very Newtonian idea, right? Everything was, A causes B. And the idea that you can have sort of events that are a-causal was something that was really, really jarring. In fact, something that, frankly, our worldview still has not incorporated. We don't understand it, right? We can confirm it. We have plenty of scientific experiments to show that it happens. But in terms of an explanatory framework, we're not even close. Jung was interested in the applications of this in, frankly, more esoteric, personal, obscure ways. Can your dreams tell you things that you shouldn't otherwise know? Can you experience a meaningful coincidence, and what does that tell you? How does that play into, your development and sense of health? But also, what does it tell you about the nature of being, right? So it's a big woolly area. I understand why, in some sense, Kastrup, wants to say idealist, that Jung wants to collapse things down. But I actually think that, looking at 50 years of him wrestling with the problem, he is wrestling with it. He doesn't necessarily stabilize it, but he sort of has the idea that there must necessarily be, beyond mind and matter, some unus mundus, right? Some one world from which these things are emanating, right? And that, of course, it's a very Platonic idea. But he was really wrestling with it. He also makes, I think, one of the cleverest contributions, in my opinion, to religious phenomenology in that area, which is, he says something that I've very much taken to heart, which is this: there really is no way, epistemologically speaking, to confirm or disconfirm the existence of God, right? There's no piece of evidence that you can get, no experience you can have, really, that would logically confirm or disconfirm right? The existence of God. If the sky split open tomorrow and a bearded head stuck out and said, "Hello, I'm God," like, we would be arguing about it everywhere on the planet, right? People would be like, it was a hallucination. No, it was actually God. No, it was actually the devil. It was aliens. Like, there's nothing that can occur to you that, interpretively speaking, can settle that problem. But what Jung points out is, while that's the case, right, the empirical existence of that sort of thing is insoluble, right? It's unanswerable. It's observable empirically that people do seem to have this kind of psychic factor, right? They have these kinds of experiences. Those experiences have a pattern. So even if it isn't the case that that is referring to something in the world, in the philosophical sense, you still have to deal with it. Right? It's still in you. And if you don't deal with it, you are lopping off a huge portion of your psyche, and you are going to, in some sense, sort of mutilate your sense of meaning if you can't come to some kind of relationship to it. And how do you come to a relationship to it? Well, interestingly enough, the language that it wants to talk in is heavily symbolic and sort of cataclysmically mystical. In other words, it wants to be communicated with in precisely the way that religions do. So is that actually some kind of supervening power in the world and structure within meaning? That's not answerable, I don't think. But it still happens. We still experience it. So you still have to deal with it in some way. And if you don't, if you decide to just put it in a box and say, bah, nonsense, you're sort of cutting yourself off from huge sources of, frankly, what it means to be human. So yeah, I think Jung's philosophical positions, frankly, they don't stabilize. In that sense, Jung is, not alone as a philosopher. Yeah. Wittgenstein's positions were all brilliant, and they changed constantly. He basically overturned everything he did in the Tractatus, which is what made him famous to begin with. But for Jung, he is really, in some sense, a therapist first and a philosopher second. And so I don't know that his position actually stabilized so much in that sense, but he really is struggling to come up with some kind of explanation, and an explanation that has utility.
Yeah, that's really helpful, actually. And you brought up his notion thinking about God. I kind of wanted to ask, he talks a lot about, he brings up gods when he talks. He brings up lots of symbolism from the past, from ancient cultures and things. And he kind of just brings it up as if, matter of fact, like, yeah, of course I'm going to talk about these kinds of things. I'm kind of interested, what do you think he thought gods were? And the backing and reason why I'm interested in this is I've heard John Vervaeke talk about how it's almost like you could think of in a dynamical systems view of our psyche, the many different attractive states, these things beyond there are attention, we can't logically manipulate them. They come before that. So I wonder what you think about that. What can you think about, say, gods in terms of like a psychological things?
Right. So this is something obviously John and I have talked about a lot. We're friends, we're colleagues. I was a student of his. And so in that sense, my own cognitive science training is Vervaekean, but I'm a distinctly non-orthodox Vervaekean. My own positions are quite a bit weirder than John's, I think, and that often informs our dialogue. Again, in keeping with my idea that it is better to practice consistency than completeness, I make a very deliberate effort to be a militant agnostic, which is I try not to stabilize my positions. So that means that on Mondays and Wednesdays, I'm willing to treat Jung's position on this stuff in a way very similar to John's. Okay, what we're dealing with is some aspect of the psyche that is manifested, right? Of course, it is the case that, consciousness is this floating on the top latecomer. It's not epiphenomenal, right? But it is, it's not an afterthought exactly either, but there's a lot going on in the system before consciousness that consciousness is not able to really get at, right? That structures what happens in terms of the operations of the mind. I think it's a reasonable position to say that is one of those things. And that's very consistent in some ways with some of the early sort of positions Jung takes. So, if you consider this idea of the archetype, which is very often how Jung described questions like sort of, these realities beyond one's own consciousness, gods. One of the ways that you can think about this is that your mind has a certain kind of structure. So, for instance, if you look at geese, okay, newly hatched geese, goslings, like when a goose egg hatches and a gosling comes out, or a little fuzzy gosling. Goslings have this early phase, which is very well known in biology, where they imprint, right? So when they come out of the egg, they imprint. What does that mean? Well, it means that sort of the first thing that they interact with that's close enough to whatever this system is designed to pattern detect, right? They will then behave like it's their mother goose, right? They'll follow it around, right? So, of course, in nature, 99.9% of the time, that means that what they're going to do is crack out of the egg and see the mother goose, and then they're going to behave in that way towards the mother goose, right? They're going to toddle after the mother goose walks. They're all going to walk in a little line, right? We've all seen this in a park with ducks or geese, or right. However, we know scientifically that if you intervene at this period, the sensitive period of imprinting, this kind of window, that you can make these geese imprint on all sorts of things, right? You can make them imprint on a hand puppet, or an experimenter, or a different kind of bird, or a ping pong ball. And if you do that and you roll the ping pong ball across the table, the ducks will all toddle after it. Now, if we think about this for a second, like at some level, metaphorically, what does that mean? It means that there's a kind of hole in the mind of a gosling, right? When the gosling hatches, there's this hole, and it's ready to receive things. But the specifics of what it's ready to receive are not set, right? It's poised developmentally to behave and comport itself in a certain way towards the thing. And in, sort of standard natural systems, that's what's going to happen. But it's not necessarily what happens. And the specific content that goes in there is a different question, right? So this hole and the material that ends up filling it, right? The hole, in a sense, is like the Jungian archetype. The material that fills it is what Jung would call the complex, okay? We can think about this, for humans as well, right? There is no human being that lacks a biological mother, right? We all have one. We're mammals. We all have a biological mother, whether or not we had a relationship with them, right? But the relationship that we have with our mother, the specifics of our mother, right, that ends up filling the hole in our psyche for mother, is going to vary enormously from person to person. The same thing goes for other forms of imprinting. So we know sexual imprinting, for instance, occurs in the animal kingdom and in humans. So in the animal kingdom, you get interesting cases where, like, I remember a case where there was a farmer who had I think, again, it was a goose. So it's a lot of goose-based stuff, but this isn't limited to geese. There was a goose that kept harassing his cows, and he couldn't figure out, it's harassing the cows, and so he shoos it away. And finally, what they figured out was that the goose actually was maybe one from his farm, and it had, at a pivotal state, sexually imprinted on cows. So it was attempting to mate with them, right? And they kept shooing it away, and it kept coming back, right? The impulse and the, like, you're my thing, right? That's what I'm into. Okay. So, and I think, unfortunately, maybe that goose eventually got kicked in the head by an annoyed cow. But you can look at the same thing in humans. So, for instance, it's often talked about that certain kinds of parasexualities in humans seem to develop under these conditions, So, a young boy has a first sexual experience where he's in a closet surrounded by shoes, and for the rest of his life, he has a real thing for shoes, right? It just hits him at that pivotal moment. Now, that's a somewhat extreme example, but the fact is that those kinds of imprints occur across the board. We have not a completely finished pattern for being. Rather, we have a system that reacts at these critical, pivotal developmental moments to bring in the material that it uses to build up its structure. So it's a combination, in a sense, of nature and nurture, right? As most things are. So yeah, I mean, in some sense, I agree with John. It's one way to look at it. It isn't the only way to look at it. And as I said, when you're reading Jung, you can decide exactly how much weirdness you're willing to swallow. If you are sympathetic towards people's accounts of things that are not well covered under our current scientific worldview, right? If you believe that people are having those experiences, then, the thing that you get most often in the skeptical community around these kinds of anomalous experiences is to discount them entirely, right? So people either say that they are lies or delusions, and they don't bother to look at perhaps what is happening. They don't ask the question, could it be the case that there is something else happening here? Science is not a closed book. I mean, it sort of can't be by definition. Science is necessarily always extending and overturning its premises. And anybody that thinks that science is even close to having the picture of reality nailed down hasn't studied science. Mm-hmm. Science is radically incomplete. So, one of my favorite games to play at conferences, especially interdisciplinary ones, is to get a bunch of, experts in the field, and when people are about 3 beers deep, you ask them the question, at the 3-pint line, you ask them the question like, so what are the unsolved problems in your discipline? And everybody says the same thing. They're all like, oh my God, we don't know anything. We don't know anything. We have all these easy problems solved, but the big problems are not solved. Uh-huh. That's pretty consistent across fields. I think that for me anyway, it would be intellectually dishonest to just discard those things as though they're complete. And I agree that certainly standards of evidence need to be maintained. But when huge numbers of people report certain kinds of experiences, we at the very least have to ask, what is happening there, right? So one way to look at that is to say, well, we're going to commit back into the naturalistic imperative and make the assumption that all of these things essentially can be accounted for in some kind of sophisticated dynamical systems theory and yada, yada, yada. Sure, maybe. But also, maybe there are things that, we have not dreamt of in our philosophy, Horatio. So I take that very seriously. So did Jung. At the end of the day, that puts you into some pretty weird positions. Jung wrote an essay about UFOs. Yeah. I don't happen to agree with his ideas on them, but I think they're intriguing. Uh-huh. And so, he, in a sense, he ends up with a theory where periodically he is trying to account for things that, frankly, science at large is mostly just throwing away. And I'm highly sympathetic to those sorts of things. If you take that seriously, very often you find that the models that we have don't adequately account for it, that there may be other factors. And the fact is, as long as we are uncertain, right, and we are profoundly uncertain about what the connection between mind and matter actually is, that stuff is not off the table.
I'm glad you bring up science then, what its place is, because I kind of wanted to ask then, you studied magic. What is the difference between magic and science? What is magic's place?
That's an interesting question. Magic, religion, and science really don't. It's something of an artificial Dewey Decimal division, to be perfectly honest, right? It's been much remarked that the concept of religion is a very Western intellectual concept, right? So what's magic? Magic and superstition are the other guy's religion, right? Your religion is well-founded, but their religion, it's a bunch of hokum, right? And the things that they do to support that religion are likewise hokum, right? So you see that position coming up in the West a lot. Wow, look at what those people are doing. That's nutty. That's nothing like, for instance, the transubstantiation of the host into the body of Christ or whatever, right? And I'm not trying to make light of that material. I think that ritual is extremely powerful. So magic, in some sense, is the other guy's religion. Demons are the other guy's gods, right? Other guys, ladies, people. In that sense, okay, science, of course, is, it has a specific role, and science is not so much a body of knowledge as it is a method, right? Science is a way of proposing hypotheses and testing those hypotheses, right? And testing them in a rigorous way. Now, what the rigor is there is itself not settled. The philosophy of science is not a done thing. So people sometimes have ideas with philosophers like Karl Popper, where they're sort of like, we have this all tied up. No, we don't. Anytime that you think we have it all tied up, I guarantee we don't. So you can just take that maybe as one of the firmest positions I'll actually offer. In that sense, okay, what does science attempt to do? Well, it attempts to test, right? Hypothesize, come up with theories, test those theories, right? In order to form a consistent explanation for how things work, very often in terms of substances rather than in terms of agency, right? So
Mm-hmm.
rather than explaining a thunderstorm in terms of the gods being pissed off or something, you explain it in terms of, the motion of forces and the interaction of systems and dynamics and so on and so forth. So that is sort of fundamental to science in some sense, and the body of knowledge that emerges from that is intended to be self-consistent. But the other part of science is, to a great extent, it's sort of the technique of it, which is to say the application of it, right? So there's the implication of your theory, but also the application of your theory. When you start to get into that, it's like, well, what do science and religion do differently? Well, they have different methods, sort of, sometimes, although there are plenty of things that we would label as religion that do have experimental systems built into them. Buddhism, most notably, right, encourages explicitly, in sort of the core text, encourages this kind of, don't take my word for it, like go and do this yourself and see what happens. But we've often seen that kind of theoretically subjective material as being outside the purview of science. Less so now. Now we're more comfortable with studying phenomena of the mind scientifically. But there's an argument to be made that these are methods of inquiry, okay, which are attempting to get us in contact with reality in some way, shape, or form. The one distinction that I might make, possibly, between, religion and magic, is to say that magic is more concerned with the practical application, right? Magic is concerned not just with getting information about stuff, but doing stuff. In that sense, it's a close cousin to science. And frankly, a lot of the sort of, the modern revival in magic in the late 19th and early 20th century, people like Aleister Crowley, for instance, would have made the case that science is magic. If we are doing something and it's effective, then we're engaged in a fundamental magical act, causing change in conformity with will, basically making what you want to happen. The distinction often is that magic will include methods of doing so that are perhaps not entirely scientifically acceptable. But even that's a pretty hazy line. So I've done lots of my work around sort of trying to bring magic somewhat within the explanatory fold of cognitive science. That's been sort of one of my big projects for a long time. And very often I think that if you're being intellectually honest, there are arguments to be made that many magical techniques can be thought of quite explicitly as sharing common roots with things that we already consider acceptable within psychology, within therapy, right? If you're willing to expand the fold. So what's the difference? It's tricky to figure out, right?
Yeah.
One thing that I will say, at least within the Western canon, magic, a bit like Jung, has always been something of a countercultural current. So, because we have a history that centralizes so much in theological church doctrine, magic carried its way forward through Western history as being this sort of countercultural thing that people were doing. They were doing research in magic, alchemy, for instance, and the various hermetic arts, sort of on their own. And those things were not completely separate from the church. Lots of clergy and stuff were dabbling in that. And the relationship between magic and religion is always a bit blurry, right? But often the people that are taking, the practice of magic and the study of magic seriously are a bit countercultural. They're sort of rebels. So certainly that's an aspect of it that has always appealed to me. I also like that do-it-yourself spirit.
Yeah, I like a lot of that, and I like that point about science maybe claims that it's a bit more objective than magic and that it's more of a method, but then we always, in a way, we as a culture have kind of said we're going to do science so we can improve things and make things better, and then you immediately have to start valuing things. Well, we want to do this and that, and again, and Viveki would say, well, we can't even do science without valuing things anyway. But and I graduated yesterday. I'm going to start calling myself an economist. So as an economist, in economics, it feels like we treat the economy as like it's a broken system. So all the science we do is like we need to do things to fix the economy, right? So it's all towards trying to do something specific. And maybe this is kind of a strange way to go, but I kind of wanted to ask, like to what degree do you think ChatGPT and large language models are they magic? In the sense that, yeah,
that's a good one. I've thought a lot about, I've been doing lots of thinking around the sort of surge of large language models. To what extent are they magic? That is an interesting question.
well, because I guess I can thinking
Well,
about it.
they certainly draw from alchemy. So there's a claim that I've made elsewhere, and I keep sort of looking to expand it into a fuller sense. One of the things that you get a lot when people talk about alchemy, right? People treat alchemy like the sort of idiot twin of chemistry. It's like we used to do alchemy, but then we realized, how much of that is bosh, and we set that aside, and now we just talk about atoms. And that is, first off, wildly historically inaccurate, frankly, when you look at it. But also, it's interesting to look at what the divisions between sort of chemistry and alchemy became, right? So the standard narrative is that chemistry sort of took the crown from alchemy and it inherited that. But I actually think that probably the real inheritor of the alchemical project is, in fact, cognitive science. So the argument that I would make here is, it's in a few parts. But when we talk about cognitive science, what is cognitive science? I mean, it's the interdisciplinary study of the mind, right? So you are trying to explain a very complex phenomenon, the mind, and you're doing so in a way that acknowledges that probably psychology in and of itself is insufficient. So you are also bringing in, and if you study it, this makes for a pretty broad reading list. But you're bringing in psychology and philosophy and neuroscience and computer science and mathematics and anthropology and. And so one of the key goals in artificial intelligence has always been the creation of a mind, right? With the idea that the best way to understand something is to be able to create it, to be able to instantiate it, right? This has sort of a precedent in Aristotle. So, the idea is if we can make a mind, if we can create a mind, then we'll have a better sense of how minds work. Now, right now, large language models and a lot of the work in AI, generally speaking, of course, has been steering closer and closer into black box territory. It does stuff, we don't know how. So it turns out that project may be more problematic than we thought. But this idea of turning inanimate matter into animate matter is central. That's a sort of a Neoplatonic idea that gets inherited by alchemy. Right? So when you are trying to elevate matter in some sense into higher states of being, that's an alchemical project. The creation of the homunculus, the philosopher's stone, all that jazz, turning lead to gold, metaphorically, that is about elevating matter. Well, that's the project of cognitive science. Solving the mind-body problem, likewise, is a huge problem, right, for cognitive science through its sort of philosophical roots, philosophy of mind, but is also quite central, actually, to the doctrines around alchemy, right? Alchemy is concerned with this idea. So, when the alchemists are, and this is sort of the Jungian psychological take, but when the alchemists are mixing chemicals together and so on and so forth, right? They're running their experiments and bubbling things and making this from that. It's not primarily that they are interested per se, right? Some of them are, in those physical transformations. They believe that rather, by creating those physical transformations, they are in some way transforming themselves, right? That changing something in the world changes something in the mind. So they're concerned with this connection, right? They believe that in some sense you can operate outside yourself. Now, that's actually very consistent with what we see, in fact, in psychology and therapy generally, right? It's just that most people don't think about it this way. So that kind of alchemical project, I think, is really, that helm has been taken up, although I don't know that most cognitive scientists, again, would think of it that way. But to me, it's actually a very obvious kind of lineage. Well, maybe not obvious. I only stumbled on that maybe 5 years ago and sort of like, oh.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Oh, you can keep going, but yeah, that's very interesting because I thought that too before, the fact that we take chemistry and it's etymologically linked to alchemy, but then like it's a weirdly like we're just gonna zoom in on little tiny things and that's the real thing. And cognitive science increasingly is being something that brings everything together. And so we talked about, I just brought up ChatGPT. kind of then wanted to ask about ways in which we like create agency and bigger agencies, and then say individuals in distributed cognition. Well, one way to well, maybe first, what name should we give to like greater agencies? We talked about gods, like egregores is a name. What do you think about that? Do you think it's reasonable to think about distributed cognition? I think about the economy and culture. To what degree, like, is it reasonable to think about sort of extended agencies?
I think it's certainly reasonable. I mean, there's a few ways to come at that. Egregore, unfortunately, is a bit of a fraught term. You know, it has some useful application within magical theory, where an egregore is, in a sense, a kind of artificial distributed mind created by a group, right? Unfortunately, like so much stuff, it's gotten tangled together with anti-Semitism, and so it's got, you know, like mucky ethics all over it by implication. You know, that sort of stuff tends to ruin a lot of things, like, you know, swastikas used to be cool before Hitler. Thanks a lot. Anyway, obviously, in some parts of the world, they're still largely untainted. So, you know, you go see a giant statue of the Buddha, and if you don't know what you're looking at, you're like, holy shit, that thing is covered in swastikas. You know, you're having your Indiana Jones moment. But yeah, the idea of sort of distributed cognition, I think that there are a few ways you can think about it. I mean, you can sort of have reference to something like Morton's concept of the hyperobject. So, you know, it's obvious that to a great extent, much of what we consider to be cognitive, right, and cultural is not constrained to your skull. It's happening in the interactions, right? It is a systemic and a dynamic phenomenon that is occurring between people. You know, culture in particular, language, right? Neither of us invented the language that we are speaking, right? That we are the inheritors of a system that is trading between people, and frankly, a great deal of the thought that's occurring in some sense occurs between us and not within us specifically, right? So clearly there are these larger structures, and you can look at lots of things that way. I mean, the economy, certainly, it's just too damn big for us to wrap our head around it. We keep trying to find these, you know, sort of little, you know, emblematic synecdoches, right? These like, oh, here's a principle that we can nail down so we can understand the big picture. And inevitably those things sort of break down because they are necessarily imperfect representations of a very large, complex phenomenon. So to what extent can we talk about there being minds independent of specific beings? Well, that's a tough question. I mean, you know, it's a very speculative question. That's kind of a 2 a.m. question. The first thing that I would say is, you know, one, people really need to jettison the idea of what I call the unitive bias, right? That they are one person. This idea that we're a one person, one brain, one mind, is frankly demonstrable horseshit. It's not true. It doesn't line up with anything that we actually see in neuroscience. There is this kind of overarching illusion of identity that's produced, but actually you're looking at a variety of dynamics and things interacting, right? And you can see this, you know, you separate the hemispheres of people's brains, you can see certain things. You can see it in things like blind sight. You can also see it in other sorts of psychological phenomena that we encounter pretty routinely in therapy. So people have these uncontrolled breakaway parts of themselves, right? A thing that I often say about psychodynamics is to say, like, the core psychodynamic insight, in a sense, comes about when you say to yourself, what was I thinking? Why did I do that? Yeah. Or somebody says you did this, and you're like, huh? Right? It is not transparent to us what our actions is, but people really cling to this idea of unitive, and it's very common for people to believe that they have some perfect access to themselves and that they are core unitive beings. That scares the shit out of them to realize that actually there's lots of stuff going on, that they're sharing the space, that they're made of other parts. So, okay, so we throw out the unitive hypothesis first. Whether or not it's the case that mind-like properties can sort of inhere in more distributed systems, I mean, that's tricky, right? I remember I had an experience a number of years ago that really, really struck me. I was walking down the street one day on my way, I think, to teach, and I went past a church, a Catholic church. And all of a sudden, it suddenly hit me that what I was looking at was the state religion of the Roman Empire on the street, right? That it was like watching a mastodon wander out of the bushes, right? Oh, there's a mastodon, right? It's like this is a pattern that has repeated itself in the world for a couple of thousand years quite consistently. Now, if we think about, say, life, right, self-replicating life or something as being, patterns that repeat themselves and assert themselves in this way, and this is a little bit more explicable to people as the idea of like Dawkins' memetics has captured people's ideas, that you can have these self-perpetuating ideas. That's been a bit screwed up by the capture of the concept of meme as pop culture image with text on it. But when you get this idea that, like, right, cultural ideas have this kind of consistency in and of themselves that tends to perpetuate over time. Well, in that sense, many of these sort of psychological structures that we think of as making up culture are very persistent patterns. So a thing that I sometimes say is like, look, there is a sense in which Superman is realer than you or I. Superman, as a consistent pattern, existed before we existed. It's been organizing matter and space for quite some time, right? Before we were born, Superman was organizing matter. After we're dead, Superman, I imagine, will still be organizing matter. And on that level, Superman is operating at about the same level as, if you're not strictly religious, devout, Christ, right? If you take a somewhat naturalistic view, nobody has interacted with Christ in a couple of thousand years. The thing that they've interacted with is narrative. They've interacted with a set of symbols and stories around Christ. But it would be stupid and short-sighted to say that those things don't have effects on the world, right? It's like a thing that you get, and this sort of speaks to the kind of scale bigotry that you mentioned earlier, which is people have this really reductionistic idea about what constitutes real. Small things are real. Bigger things aren't real. It's like, why? Why? That's just an assumption. It's an assumption that small things are realer than big things. That makes no sense to me. In that sense, right, people often say things when they hit the sort of like nihilistic phase of their, Darwinist materialism period, where they'll say things like, love doesn't even exist, right? Love isn't real. And it's like, what are you talking about? Like, the fact that there are chemicals involved doesn't mean that something doesn't exist, right? It just means that at one level it's chemicals and another level it's something else, but it's still having effects. Love moves people in the world, right? You can't say that something, it's stupid to say at some level that something, stupid is a bit harsh, but I think it's a bit myopic maybe to say that something isn't real. If it can sail 1,000 ships towards Troy, that sounds pretty damn real to me. Right? So many of these ideas move the world in powerful ways, right? And they have a persistence in the world, and yet we can't wrap our heads around them all at once. And so the fact that they're sort of largely invisible to us puts them outside the scope of what we would typically consider an object, right? That's sort of Morton's hyperobjects. I think that, considered in that way, who's to say? Do do systems of thinking think their own thoughts? I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. But certainly it's the case that they seem to have their own, resilience. They have their own structure. They push back. Try changing a system of thought sometime and see what happens. It's quite resistant to that individually and as a group, right? So, at some level, you can play the reductionistic game on that too. If you're willing to think that, well, I'm real, yeah, okay, but you're a collection of dynamics and thoughts and beliefs and so on and so forth. What's the difference between those things operating, inside your skull and outside your skull?
Yeah. And when I talked to you off the air before, you talked about corporations and whether they might be demons, in the sense of, you can say, oh yeah, it's a group of people, and I guess they have loads of buildings and factories, and what is it? And then we, spend millions on them, or they, they ruin the economy and whatever the economy is and whatever money is, Well, okay, so we talked about like these kind of, egregores, or not a good word, but these broader sort of agencies. I kind of then wanted to ask the current day. I'm trying to think about like a world of present. In what ways are like psychologically are we influenced by these kind of patterns? Because one time one thing that can help is one time I heard you talk about how the rise of superhero movies and how we're kind of, we're influencing maybe our, collective unconscious in a sense of, so what is, say, we kind of sometimes feel like we're kind of history kind of ended and now we're over, we've science is figuring stuff out. In what ways is our mind still, and collectively we're sort of being taken over by agencies that we kind of realize, in the present day?
Okay, that's a lot, but the answer I would say is, I mean, enormously. So okay, to address those things sort of rapid fire, it's a bit of glib shorthand when I say that, corporations are demons. What I mean is that they're sort of theoretically immortal entities, which are granted legal personhood. So they're people under the law. And even more so, for instance, in the States, post Citizen United, right? There, turns out money is speech. Who knew? So, we've granted them a kind of personhood. They have a discernible psychological makeup. There's a very interesting documentary, I think it's a Canadian documentary from about 20 years ago, called The Corporation, which asks the question, okay, well, let's take this at face value. Let's say that corporations are people, right? What kind of people are they? And so it sort of treats them, okay, if these were people, let's look at their behavior. And what it does fairly systematically is show that you can map the behavior of corporations by their very nature to the Hare checklist, which is the standard method that you use to diagnose psychopathy, right? Not that psychopathy is primarily diagnosable anymore. You won't find it in the DSM. But the point is that the Hare checklist is this pretty well, used tool that you use to figure out who's a psychopath. So, okay, they're immortal psychopaths with legal rights that influence people. Okay, well, I mean, that sounds like a demon, right? Now, corporations are a lot more fragile than people think, right? Their average lifespan is actually quite low.
Right.
But, above and beyond that, there are, as you mentioned, there's a kind of entanglement, actually, between lots of things that I'm talking about and economy, period. So, as an example, in terms of influence, this is something I've sort of stumbled over for a long time. And I understand there's some movement in economics around this area, but this notion of the rational actor, okay, within economics. So, the rational actor, a very kind of Enlightenment era sort of thing, is that people are fundamentally rational actors and they will undertake, economic decisions which rationally are the best for them, right? That was sort of a core premise for a very long time. Something that I think is maybe overturning now, but it was a core premise for a long time. Okay, that sounds fine. Until you consider that the fundamental basis of capitalist consumerism is compelling people to make economic decisions that are not in their best interests, right? So, especially from, in the 20th century, a guy, Edward Bernays, okay? Edward Bernays, who was the inventor of, he invented the term, coined the term public relations, okay? And really invented, to a great extent, what we think of as modern advertising. Well, interestingly, Edward Bernays had been a propagandist in World War I. That had been his original thing. He did propaganda. And when the war ended, he got contacted by a bunch of companies who were like, hey, we've been overproducing like mad for the war. How do we sell this crap, right? How do you get people to buy this crap, right? We need people to buy it because if they don't, the whole economy collapses. We need people to consume. So do you think you can use propaganda to get people to consume? They didn't want to call it propaganda, so they changed it to public relations, PR. But the other interesting thing about Bernays is that while he was struggling to figure this out, as it happens, Edward Bernays was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. Mm-hmm. And so he sent money to Freud in Vienna, because Freud was on hard times. It's like, here's some American money, Uncle Siggy. And Uncle Siggy in return said, thank you, and sent a complete set of his books. Edward Bernays cracks these open, starts reading through them and says, oh my God, this is it. This is it. This is the key. You don't, in fact, sell people things by making rational appeals. You sell things to people by appealing to unconscious factors that are emotionally driven and symbolic. So prior to Bernays, most advertisement took the form of rational appeal. Advertisements would either be straight up snake oil, right, lies, or they would say things like, buy Gold Bond foot powder because it keeps your feet the driest, right? After Bernays gets this idea that what you do is you just symbolically link things together in this way that manipulates unconscious structures through fear and lust, because he's reading Freud, right? So I highly recommend, actually, anybody that's interested in this, go read, rather go watch. There's a 4-hour documentary, Adam Curtis, called The Century of the Self, that outlines this stuff really well. And you can watch it for free on YouTube. It's terrific. Even if you watch the first hour, it'll outline this stuff. And it's shocking for most people. So, he does this famous thing where women didn't smoke at the time. It was considered dirty, right? Men smoked, women didn't smoke. Cigarette companies wanted to sell more cigarettes. So he came up with this idea. He went and consulted with a psychoanalyst and blah, blah, blah. And then he came up with this campaign. And so he sort of arranged to get the press at a parade at a certain time when a parade was including a group of society debutantes, right? Feminist women. And so at a prearranged time, they all reached into their coats, and there's the press ready to get it on camera, right? Something's going to happen. And they all pull out cigarettes, which were considered unfeminine and dirty, and lit them up as, quote, torches of freedom. So he linked it, right, symbolically, torches of freedom. I mean, that's some dark genius, that is, right? That's sorcery. This idea of torches of freedom, that smoking is somehow an act of freedom and feminism. And the rate on smoking skyrockets after this. The two things get tied together. That is not a rational appeal. And that is the basis on which advertising proceeds thereafter, right? It proceeds in this PR mold. So necessarily, this is not operating on a rational actor. What that means is that the consumerist capital economy, which already is full of a bunch of illogical nonsense, right? The whole idea of an infinite growth economy just does not square with the natural realities of the planet, so far as I can tell. You can't have an infinite growth system exponentially in a finite system, period, right? And unfortunately, we seem to be hitting the wall on that problem, but we'll see how that goes. The point is, right, if we don't keep that system growing all the time, the whole thing implodes. If you stop buying shit, the whole thing implodes, right? You can't stop buying shit. And this is not shit that you need. It's mostly shit you don't need, that you are convinced to need to meet an emotional need that it will not meet. The products themselves are often garbage, right? It's like, buy more shoes, buy more bobbleheads, buy fragrances, buy vaginal washes, buy this, buy that. It preys on your anxieties and your desires, gets you to buy things. Because if you stop buying stuff, the economy implodes, right? We have to produce and we have to consume. So much so that, in the wake of 9/11, for instance, one of the first things George W. Bush, the president, did was go out and say, get into the mall, everybody. Because this sucker could go down, as he said. That was the financial crisis later. But the point is, right, the whole system is predicated on this idea of making these irrational symbolic appeals. It basically took the healing arts of psychotherapy and turned them into black magic. And to be honest, that stuff it was predicted. So there's a really interesting theorist named Ion Culianu. He was sort of one of the primary students of Eliade. Really, really interesting guy. And he wrote a book called, unfortunately, he died tragically early. He was murdered in a toilet on a campus in the States, very possibly by the Romanian secret police. Interesting story. But this guy, Ion Culianu, wrote this really interesting book called Eros and Magic in the Renaissance. And the argument that he makes is that when you look at the sort of Renaissance reemergence of magic into the cultural sphere, you can look at a series of people, Marsilio Ficino, et cetera, leading up to Giordano Bruno, right? And in particular, when you look at what these guys are talking about, when they're talking about Eros and magic, okay? When they mean eros, they don't just mean erotic in the sense that we use erotic casually, sex, right? What they mean is the production of desire, right? The production of desire. And the systems that they're talking about is about producing, the manipulation of eros with symbolism. And Culiano points out basically that Bruno makes this really an interesting argument. Bruno, fascinating guy who deserves much, much more attention. Galileo sort of caved and got off the hook. They burned Bruno for, among other things, proposing that there was life on other planets. Oh, no. Interesting guy. I left an offering at his statue when I was in Italy last. So Bruno basically proposes that in the future, okay, rulers won't necessarily need to resort to the use of naked force to compel the cooperation of their populations. Instead, they'll use magic. And when he says that, what does he mean? What he means is that they'll use symbolic systems to produce eros in the population. He's talking about propaganda, okay? In that sense, and this is Culiano's, I think, fascinating and underexamined point, Culiano proposes that we all live in what he calls sorcerer states, which is to say that these sort of, the forces that are largely in control of the movement of society, politics and the economy, right, routinely are using these kinds of systems to manipulate people at large. It's the manufacture of consent, right? Propaganda and advertising in not necessarily a rational way. And if you look at politics, you can see just how damn irrational it's all become, right? People are not behaving rationally. They're behaving in these bizarre, counterintuitive, often frankly self-destructive ways because these symbol systems are hammering at them. So this idea that we live in a sorcerer state and that everything is sort of predicated on this kind of sorcery, if you get hung up on the use of the word sorcery or magic, you're going to throw that out. You're going to be like, there aren't a bunch of guys in black robes operating stuff. No, but what there are is a bunch of people who are using those techniques and to direct descendants of those techniques to manipulate us. It's not accidental, and it's not sort of unknown, right? It's designed to manipulate. You can look at the theory around it, right? The manufacture of consent, propaganda, advertising, etc. If we conceive that those things, essentially speaking, are derived from the symbolic magical traditions, right? Yeah, we live in sorcerer states. So the idea that we are being programmed in some sense, yeah, sure, that's true of every human culture because we can't program ourselves. We can do metaprogramming, but the programming that we receive off the bat is mostly we just absorb it, right? We don't ask those questions, and that stuff goes deep. A game I like to play sometimes with Christians, right? And I'm sort of I don't know if I'm even a lapsed Christian. My mom was Catholic. My dad likes science fiction and marijuana. So it's unclear exactly where that, or cannabis, I suppose is the proper term now, where that places me. I am not a Christian. I have a lot of respect for Christianity, but I'm not a Christian. But if you talk to Christians, okay, you talk about, say, Christmas, okay, you say to them, okay, what's the nativity scene? And they'll say, oh, well, the nativity scene is a set of little statues that we set up, right? And what it's meant to do is it's meant to depict the story of the birth of Jesus. See, here's the angel, and here's the manger, and here are Mary and Joseph, right? Here's the baby Jesus, right? Or if you're a bit blasphemous, based on the tender and mild description, you could put a small ham in there. The point is, all those animals are there. It's a symbolic depiction with statues meant to reenact that, right? They have an explanation for it. Okay. And then you say, okay, and what's the deal with your Christmas tree? And they say, and you say, what does it have to do with Christmas?
Mm-hmm.
And they say, there's an angel on top. And you say, okay. And they say, I don't know. We've just always done it. I don't know. We've just always done it is actually far, far more central to most of the kind of patterns, including ritual ones that people undertake, right? Super interesting experiment, I think, goes a long way to explain this. So there's this classic experiment where they got a chimpanzee, chimpanzees properly, and toddlers, and they got them to solve this puzzle, okay? So the puzzle was, do you know this one?
Yeah, you've explain it, but yeah.
It fascinates me. So, okay, so the puzzle works like this. you got this box, okay? And the box has like a crank and a button and a thing, and okay. So you put this thing down, and kids and chimps are both quite observant. So what you do is, as the adult, you walk in and you go and you turn the crank and you flip the lever and you twist the thing and you push the button and you pull out this little tray, and there's a treat inside. So the kid gets, a candy, and the chimp gets a peanut, right? Something it likes. Fine. You run through the sequence a couple of times, and both the kid and the chimp will pick that sequence up very fast, very, very fast, right? And then they can do it. They'll crank the crank, flip the lever, push the button, pull the tray out. Okay, great. Step one. Step two, you repeat that experiment, except in this case, the box is transparent. So since the box is transparent, you can see that the mechanisms that you're manipulating have nothing to do with the tray, right? They're completely disconnected. It has no relationship really to the tray. What happens now is the chimp watches you go through this sequence of things and looks at you like you're a fucking idiot, and then pulls the tray out and just eats the peanut, right? It's like, why would I do this? Yeah. But the kid, the toddler, will go through the sequence anyway, even though they can see the same thing. And one interpretation of that is, oh, it turns out kids are stupider than chimps. But that's wrong. What it really means is that humans, okay, far more so than chimps, are making a bet. It's an evolutionary bet. They're making a bet that even though they don't understand why you're doing it, that there's probably a reason. And so they'd better replicate it anyway. They don't need to know what the reason is. They just replicate the behavior. And that bet, right, is essentially that's the sort of mimetic properties of culture. There are a vast number of things that we do simply because they're done, right? We do things the way that they're done. It takes a lot of effort. I mean, everybody goes, I think, through some point in their life where they try to break out a little bit from the thing that they inherited, the way that their family did things or the way that their culture did things. They step back and they start to ask those sorts of questions. And that stuff is hard, right? As I said before, try changing a system of thought sometime and see what happens. Pushing back on that stuff is hard because it's very built into us and people defend it, right? They'll defend it, even if they don't know why. You have to do it that way. Why? That's how it's done. So, yeah.
Go for it.
No, sorry. So that's basically the gist of it. It's like we're all coming up in these kinds of systems where we're being imprinted with patterns that we're not necessarily stepping back and considering rationally. And frankly, in some of those cases, it is foolhardy to throw things away if we don't know why. That's Chesterton's fence post is this idea, right? Which is, Chesterton and a buddy are walking through the countryside. Buddy just bought a piece of land. They come across this set of fence posts, and the guy says, I'm going to rip all these out. And Chesterton says, what are they for? The guy says, I don't know. That's why I'm ripping them out. And Chesterton says, maybe you want to ask your neighbors why they're there first, right? So the assumption that you just rip something out because you don't see what it's for is sometimes profoundly stupid. It's something, frankly, that our culture has done a bunch of. We've ripped out the fence posts in all kinds of places because we were like, this is dumb. Let's not do that. Oh, it turns out maybe that has effects. If we're going ahead into, because you mentioned the superhero thing, sorry, I'm trying to keep all this in mind. Yeah, superhero culture is interesting.
We can go into that. Like, again, maybe it would be beneficial to stick with this, the gorilla and the child who internalizes and does everything. Maybe it will help us lead on to that, because I find that fascinating. Because, as you say, it's kind of necessary for culture. Things are so complicated. Like, we better do like exactly what other people have done. But as well, like in our own culture, I notice in my everyday life, I do the exact thing someone else does. I'm like, I'm pretty sure I don't need to do that, but I'm just gonna do exactly what they did in the line or whatever at the gym, because I just assume maybe something's gonna like collapse and you explode if I do it slightly differently. I just don't want that to happen. So, and in a way, sometimes it does go really wrong. You're like, oh, I should have done exactly what they did. So I don't know. Do you think it's like that's kind of what humans are? It's we have to. I think how inherent is it to us?
Like most things, right? This exists on a spectrum. I happen to be, I think, just by either upbringing or genetics, or probably some combination of those things, a kind of person who has a very hard time doing things just because. I tend to question things quite inherently. That's a very double-edged sword. On one hand, it means that I think most of the promotions I ever had at any job I ever had came about because, after the first day of training, I said, why do we do it this way? This is fucking dumb. Here's a better way to do it. And that got me promotions, right? It's very proactive and whatever. But the flip side of that is I actually find it really hard to just take things on because other people take them on. One of my mottos used to be, the minority isn't always right, but the majority is always wrong. Because if the majority was right, things would be different and better. And so, there are things that I had to sort of discover independently that, like, this is a funny example, but shoes. I used to wear boots, okay, like combat boots, from the time I was a teenager, year round. Because to me, it's like, well, obviously it's better utility. They're tougher and blah, 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 blah. Never mind that they're terrible at the beach, that they're no good for formal events, that whatever. It took me a long time to finally buy a pair of sandals, for instance, and be like, oh, there's a reason people had these, right? So my natural bent is very much in that other direction. I often have to sort of discover it for myself. And so sometimes I'm kind of an idiot in that respect. But the flip side of that is that I do question those patterns. And sometimes the questions do need to be, sometimes patterns do need to be questioned. So the counterpoint to Chesterton's fence post that I like to bring up sometimes is what, it's a thing John and I came across, which I call a mimeograph problem. So here's how this works. Here at the University of Toronto, when you have an exam coming up, an examination at the end of your course or something, like 3 weeks ahead of time, you have to take your exam and you have to submit it to a central department, like 3 weeks ahead of time. That creates some problems because it isn't the case necessarily that you know exactly what you're going to get through in the last 3 weeks, right? Arguments tend to be somewhat fluid. Maybe you're covering slightly different material, whatever. You don't know necessarily what you're going to get. And so the problem of having to submit it 3 weeks in advance means you often kind of have to leave some of that stuff off the exam because you don't know if you're going to cover it adequately. Okay, fine. So there was a period of time where John Vervaeke was also teaching at another university here in Toronto. We have three. So he was teaching at another university and he was teaching a philosophy course. And so he comes up towards the end of his course at this other university and he says, where do I have to submit my exam? And the person, his administrator says, huh? And he says, where do I need to submit my exam? Like, and the person says, what are you talking about? Just like print it off and bring it in on the day? Like print the sheets off for the exam. Mm-hmm. John's like, but don't I have to submit it? Because that's what you have to do at U of T. No. Okay. So he goes back to U of T. And the assumption, reasonable assumption, I shared it too, is that there was like, some rational reason why we were submitting it 3 weeks in advance, right? Maybe they went through and checked it or they filed it in some giant vault or something, right? So he asked, why do we submit things 3 weeks in advance at the University of Toronto? And the answer is to give them time to mimeograph it. And if you're like, huh, you're not alone. Mimeograph or mimeography is a primitive pre-photocopying technique of printing. You sort of paint ink onto a big typeset drum. You'll see this sometimes, like you get things where kids are like making homemade newspapers where they take the paper and they whoop, whoop, whoop through the drum and it comes out. That's mimeography, okay? So when they used to have to make copies of exams, they would need time to set up the mimeography equipment and, typeset the drum and paint the drum with purple ink and shit and run it through and print copies off. So, you got to give them like 3 weeks to create the mimeographed copies. But we don't mimeograph them. We haven't done so in a long time, right? So why do we do that? And the answer is we do it because we've done it, right? It's like laws that you get on the books. I think, if I'm not wrong, in the UK, it's still legal to shoot a Scotsman if they're within bowshot of the walls of York. Last I checked, that's still on the books. There are also some fascinating UK laws around witchcraft. You should look into this stuff. Now, would any of this stuff actually, pass muster in a court? Probably not. it would get flipped, but it's still on the books, right?
Mhm.
Theoretically, you could actually go and make an argument. You're like, well, yeah, I did shoot him, Your Honor, but the law says, he's a Scotsman. He was within bowshot of the walls of York, so
Mhm.
I'm within my legal rights. These mimeograph problems are where we get these sorts of like, vestigial appendages within our systems of thought, right? Like, like bits of organ that aren't really doing anything anymore, but they're still in the system. So there's this trade-off,
Yeah.
obviously, between your Chesterton's fence posts and your mimeograph problems, and knowing which is not an easy question.
Mhm.
Most people tend to be somewhat conservative. They skew more in the direction of the mimeograph than they do ripping the post set, right? But of course we do, and that's something you see on a spectrum, right? Some people are going to tend to be a bit more rebellious. They're going to be more open. They're going to be more questioning. They're going to be whatever. They're going to ask those sorts of questions. But neither one of those is sort of a perfect and stable answer. You can't just do one or the other, or you run into problems. You have to have an ongoing balance. And so it's one of the very numerous places in psychology where you hit what's called the no free lunch hypothesis, which is that sort of by mathematical proof, any place that you have a functional heuristic, there is an equal number of conditions where that heuristic is a useful heuristic as it is a counterproductive bias, right?
And on this point of this trade-off between it's good to do things as they've been done, but then it's also bad. It makes me think that maybe science itself is something which emerged to go against that natural human instinct of just do things as they're done and go, actually, no, let's find new things out. What if everything actually is wrong? What if we study things really hard, we can do it?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that might help us understand the distinction between magic and science, which is maybe actually appreciating this trade-off relationship, right? That, okay, science, we could go and just rip things apart and get the fence out, but then magic's like, well, I actually don't know exactly why this works. I'm not going to be able to explain it to you, but it does work, and so I'm going to do it.
Right. I'm not going to be able to remember. I won't be able to make a proper academic reference, so I'm sort of committing a reference sin here. John is much better at this stuff than I am, but there is a theorist who once said, and I have it sort of secondhand through John, that if common sense is explaining the unfamiliar in terms of the familiar, science is explaining the familiar in terms of the unfamiliar. So this is one of the places where I think, again, the sort of folk conception of science and what science is actually doing are very different things. Science is a weirding of the world, right? It explains the familiar in terms of the unfamiliar, right? It's not about finding something you already get. It's about trying to do an analysis to understand something that often takes you in a strange, unfamiliar, counterintuitive territory. So a story I tell fairly often, I was at a pub near campus. I was waiting for somebody and they were running a bit late. So I think I hit the 3-pint steep line by myself while I was waiting for them. And behind me, there was a group of, charged up young undergraduates who were sort of sitting and having this conversation, and art students, I think, almost certainly actually. And, one of these people was a, well-spoken young fellow who was sort of holding court. He was on a bit of a tear. And the tear that he was on was how science had tragically, it was very much in a romantic mold, science had tragically demystified the world, and it had made things like too boring and explicable and so on. I'm sitting and I'm drinking my beer. And as is often the case, I have to sort of restrain myself from entering into the public discourse because it's not public discourse, right? So I try to keep my opinions to myself, but 3 pints deep. So it gets to a certain point, he's sort of holding forth, and finally I was like, I turned around and I said, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? You think science has made the world less mysterious? Science has not made the world less mysterious. Science has made the world vastly more mysterious, right? When you really look at it, the weirding that science does in terms of our conceptions of things, there are things that we kind of got pretty much nailed down scientifically a century ago, we still can't wrap our heads around, right? We still, frankly, I don't think most people can really get relativity and quantum mechanics, which are like the pillars of modern physics, and it's a century old. That stuff is hard to understand. And we can understand it formally to some extent, mathematically. But when you attempt to actually cash that out in terms of like, well, what are we talking about here? Right? You know, it's weird. Science is weird. So yeah, to a great extent, I think science as an analytical discipline, if it's being, you know, if its production of knowledge is honest, typically it leads us into explaining the familiar in terms of the unfamiliar. It's a profound weirding of the world. But you know, and this is somewhat pointed out by Thomas Kuhn, right, in Structure of Scientific Revolutions. But just in general, that isn't how most people relate to it. Most people don't relate to it that way. And a lot of that has to do with people's sort of the degree of difference in ambiguity tolerance and ambiguity intolerance. So most people they don't tolerate ambiguity very well. It freaks them out. And again, this is something you see in a spectrum on the population. There are some people that tolerate it very well, right? You know, they tend to be sort of relatively high openness, but like, you know, they find paradoxes sort of delightful, right? Mysteries. Oh, neat. Isn't it neat to think about things that we can't? Wow. Will we ever understand that? But that's not actually the dominant position. The dominant position for most people is that they go, they do not like it because it tends to destabilize what they want to be a relatively stabilized sense of certainty. People are kind of addicted to certainty. This is a bit of a bugbear for me because I think our addiction to certainty is profoundly off base. So yeah,
you must get that reaction from a lot of people when you sort of talk about the things you're interested in, and they're like, so some people must love it, and some people must go, actually, please, I can't take all this in.
It depends. I mean, this is one of the, if you're going to do this sort of work, it's one of the things you have to do as an educator. You know, there's an idea that comes out of you know, the classics, this idea of Socratic aporia. Right. So when Socrates used the Socratic method to talk to people philosophically, he was trying to drive them towards a state called aporia. So what he would do was ask, you know, gentle inquiries, or he would get them to like, you know, well, what do you think this is? And they would give an answer and he'd be like, oh, that's interesting. So, but if that, then what this? And they would say, oh, la, 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 la. And eventually they would get to aporia, the gap, basically. And the gap was like the, I don't know moment. That's what he was trying to induce. Right? The feeling that they don't know. I only know that I do not know. Now, the problem with traditional aporia, in my opinion, is that it pisses people off, right? Like the coda to the story of Socrates is he was put to death, right? If you try to do this educationally, people feel like you're bullying them. So they either throw you out, right? They either throw it away, or they, you know, there are various forms of sort of psychological resistance depending on their degree of ambiguity tolerance, right? Strict aporia typically doesn't work that well. People feel like they're under assault. You know, try doing a philosophical analysis of somebody's, you know, closely held premise, because our premises are largely often inconsistent. It will piss them off really fast, right? Not invariably. Some people like it, but it's not easy to tell, you know, who's who. I was probably 25 before I finally managed to get the distinction. That's like, oh, I just like to argue about stuff, but some people appear to like to argue about stuff, but then they get real mad at you, right? They take it personally. Instead, I use something that I sometimes call Hamletic aporia after Shakespeare. And so the idea here is, instead of assaulting their premises, you just introduce so much material that you sort of blitz the system, right? It's like you flood the system with chaff, interesting chaff, and you do it in a friendly, funny way that's interesting, so that people can track their interest. But also when they try to put it all together, they're like, and then you guide them back in and you're like, but it's okay. It's okay, right? You make people feel safe and contained. Essentially, it's therapeutic. In its structure. So that's something in some sense that I've imported into education from my other work. But, you know, if you're gonna break the foundations of what people think, you got to be kind of gentle about it, You know, you can't just disrupt people's sense of certainty and leave them spinning in space. They don't handle that well. So you have to sort of make paradox fun. And paradox can be fun. People can enjoy paradox in the right context. They can enjoy contradiction. They can enjoy uncertainty. They can develop a taste for it. But you have to do that in a specific way. And very often education, you know, doesn't do that. It just feeds you the line or busts down your counterpoints. Good education, especially in science, should be unpacking those questions. But even still, it's a pretty delicate balancing act. So yeah, sometimes I talk to people and what they do is they go, and they shut down. They either go, I don't know, I need a sandwich. Or they say, like, I can't handle this. We're going to stop talking about this. But other people, lots of people come out and they crack a smile, right? Because you're like, look, reality is full of holes. The sooner you grasp, in some sense, that reality is full of holes, the more freedom you have to move around.
That I'm good. We can end this soon. I don't know if you have more time. This has been great.
I actually have to go to the dentist.
Okay.
So the mundane concerns.
Okay. So it's good timing. But we'll I guess one final thing. Do you think that attitude of maybe being desiring too much to sort of not change too much, do you think that kind of has happened maybe a bit in science or culture more generally? That like we don't really want to change things?
Yeah, I mean, it's always happening. Some of it is inherent. So, you know, Kuhn, right, Structure of Scientific Revolutions, he makes this point, the distinction between, you know, sort of regular science, normal science, and revolutionary science. So for the most part, what science is doing is, you know, they're technicians. What scientists are doing is filling out the existing theory with lots of confirmatory evidence and experiment. But eventually, the holes in the theory pile up to the point you get enough paradoxes and unresolved problems that you require a new theory, often that is radically distinct from the theory that it's looking to replace. And then you got to fight. That's what happens in every discipline. That fight almost never goes smoothly. What actually happens is that the people who were champions of the original theory that have tenure eventually die, and the people who have the new theory take over, and then you get a new theory inside that scientific revolution, right? So, but you can see that tension right there. There are certainly scientists who have this kind of like, let's ask questions, right, attitude, but it's less common than you would think. For the most part, it's about like, no, let's explain things using the existing tools. And if you start questioning those tools, they'll freak out. Another game that I like to play at conferences, this is the second game, other than what are the unsolved problems in your discipline. I like to play the game, which is called, and I play it with everybody, but with people who are high on their disciplines, it's especially interesting when you get the candor 3 pints deep, is what's the weirdest thing that's ever happened to you? And what's the weirdest thing you've ever experienced that you find difficult to explain? And people always have stuff. And they will often, you know, they'll sort of hedge around and come up with some kind of pseudo-naturalistic hand-wavy explanation to get it offside. But a lot of the time, what they'll do is tell you about something that is like radically weird that happened that they cannot explain. And 99 times out of 100, you say to them, so what did you do with that? And they say, nothing. I put it in the drawer and walked away. It's too radioactive, right? It would undermine too much. The same thing is true at large. So humans have what's called the normalcy bias, right? And the normalcy bias is the assumption that the way that things are is the way that things are more or less going to be, right? You see this also at the personal level in what's called the end of history illusion, which is this peculiar thing where if you check with people over time about their beliefs, you know, so you check in with somebody at 20 and you say, how much have your beliefs changed in the last 10 years? And they say, oh, tons, you know, and then you say, great, how much do you think your beliefs will change, right? Your positions and your values will change in the next 10 years. And they'll say, oh, not much. Then you check in with them 10 years later at 30 and you say, so how much have things changed for you in the last 10 years? And they'll say, oh, tons. And by 40, what would you anticipate? And they'll say, oh, not much. And this goes straight down the line. We operate under this peculiar, seemingly inbuilt illusion, right? That we're more or less the finished product. Maybe we're going to get a little richer or a little happier, hopefully, or we're going to get something. But mostly that's just, it's going to be filigree on the finished person that is us. That is not the case. What in fact we see is, a more radical transformation. Same thing with the normalcy bias in culture. I see this a lot, especially when I'm talking about sort of the direction of civilization and the environmental and meaning crisis concern specifically, which is people have this really deeply ingrained sense that things will be as they have been, right? That the way that things are outside right now, that's how it's going to be. It's like, no, I don't think so, actually. This is very anomalous, what we're doing right now. All of this stuff, this is not business as usual, so to speak. It's just business as usual in the very limited scope of a few generations of humans.
Yeah.
And civilization, period, is new. It's so new, right? It's like 100 generations or something of humans. That's nothing. It's nothing. It's a drop in the bucket in our evolutionary history. So, our whole existence as we think of it, we have this idea, and this is where you get sort of the Jetsons future, right? Cartoons where, the future is, everything is basically the same, except your vacuum talks and you go to make widgets in a flying car for the boss. It's the 50s, but in the future. And it's like, no. And so maybe to tie this back around, if you want to look at something like large language models and the sort of progress in AI, I have some question about where that stuff is going. I am, as in most things, I've made a decision not to decide because I think it's beyond my powers to anticipate fully, other than speculatively. But, we're pretty clearly steering into completely uncharted territory. So anybody that tells you that they have a really good sense of where this is going is talking out of their ass. The whole definition of the singularity, right? And sort of how that was taken up by Kurzweil and people like that, the singularitarian movement. The whole concept of the singularity is borrowed from physics. A singularity is the boundary, right, around, it's the event horizon, in a sense, around a black hole, past which nothing can be determined. So if you look and you're like, wow, I really don't know where things are going, it's like, yeah, you don't, right? Black box technologies that act like people, we have no idea. And, some of it is anticipatable, obviously, right? The political cycle in the next period of time is going to be an absolute shit show. It's going to be a gong show, right? We thought false information was an issue before. Wait for it. Desktop deepfakes of politicians. How many people have the critical faculties to question those things? If they put up a thing of Hillary Clinton saying, yes, I eat babies, how many people are just going to watch that and go, see? And you can see how, in fact, that kind of virtuality, that mediated reality, mediality and this stuff, we're running a massive series of parallel, completely unmonitored experiments on the entire planet and the entire species. The economy, civilization, technology, right down to little things, putting some substantial population of our youth on, stimulants, speed, amphetamines, is that a thing? I guess. Let's put 20% of the population on amphetamines all the time. I'm sure we know what will happen. Microplastics, right? Plastics, wonder of the future, right? Well, what's that line in the film The Graduate? Plastics. Well, yeah, we didn't really see where that was going. And in general, when we think about this stuff, there's the event horizon, the singularity, but there's also this sort of the hyper object problem, things outside of our scope. So this is maybe my final point on this area for sort of the unforeseen. When we introduced the automobile, the internal combustion engine, right? We saw it at a very limited scale. What did we see? Personal convenience. What we saw was a machine that can get you from point A to point B, right? Seems like a good idea. But when you step back into the geological timescale, and when you step back into a global timescale, it turns out that cars being able to get us from point A to point B is an extremely minor part of their function as a machine. What the internal combustion engine actually is a giant distributed terraforming engine that takes carbon out of the ground and pumps it into the atmosphere to turn the planet to Venus. It's a terraforming machine. It just happens to drive us around, right? When you scale back. We thought we were getting personal convenience, right? The age of happy motoring. But what we were actually getting was a terraforming engine that's heating up the planet. Likewise, I've made the argument that I didn't, but when everybody else signed up for Facebook, what we thought we were getting was personal convenience, connection, community, right? Because we didn't have any. So community, that's what we thought we were getting. But actually what we were getting, it turns out, was a giant globally distributed engine to heat up the temperature of discourse. Oops. So we're bad at seeing those kinds of unintended consequences. And so the fact that, we're developing this technology, and I frankly don't see it stopping anytime soon, it should give people a bit of pause. And if you think that you know where it's going, you don't. Abandon your certainty.
Thank you very much. I had more questions, but usually I go to the dentist, and for some reason I just got really tired. But this has been great.
Well, I'm happy to talk again at some point.
Yeah.
You're slept and I'm scrubbed.
and we could do on like completely different topics, because again, you have so much to sort of say. Well, I'll put some of the things you talked about in like links in the description for people to find. But where can people find more about you and your work?
Probably the best port of entry, to be honest, is my YouTube channel. So if you just want to drop a link, I've got, I don't know, 100 odd hours of lecture or something up there. It was something I didn't anticipate creating, but the pandemic curveballed all of us. So the time in what I call the involuntary monastery of lockdown turned out to have side benefits. So yeah, if you're sort of interested in my work and stuff, you can see a pretty wide variety of lectures there. That's a pretty good port of entry.
Thank you. All right, awesome.
Thank you.
I'll start recording. Thank you.